Let us now understand the process of carrying out review of related literature. It passes through a number of steps, and the very first step in carrying out review of related literature is to identify the key words in the problem. For example, if you are interested in studying the relationship between emotional intelligence and job satisfaction of teachers working in technical institutions, the key words here are emotional intelligence, job satisfaction, maybe technical teachers, and relationship or correlation, you can say. The first step involves identifying the key terms which can be used to search the literature which is available in various sources of information. It will include the terms as well as the variables which have been selected for this study. The next step in carrying out review of related literature is identifying the sources of information. A number of sources of information are available to the researcher which provide details about the published work of the practitioners, academicians, and researchers. As a researcher, you try to access the literature from books, journals, dictionaries, thesaurus, encyclopedia, or handbooks, and you try to collate that information. So before a researcher actually locate the information and try to abstract that information, it becomes important to identify and locate the sources of information which can be broadly classified into preliminary sources of information such as dictionary, thesaurus, indexes, etc. And then the researcher should identify the primary sources of information. That is, the researcher himself has produced a report or researcher has contributed a journal article, that is a primary source of information. So, what primary sources, the reports, the dissertations, the doctoral research work, or the journal articles which are available? So, the person has to identify those sources of information. In addition to that, there are secondary sources of information. Now, when I say secondary sources of information, all sources of information where the researcher's work is reported by another person. So, there are cross references in the journal article which are available to any reader. Those sources become the secondary sources of information. For example, a journal article written by you and you are trying to quote the researches which have already been done and you are quoting the authors. So your journal article become a secondary source for all that previous work which you have included in your article. Now once you identify which preliminary, primary, and secondary sources you are going to access, then the next step in the process of research is to abstract the information from those sources of information. Let us first see which is the order which you would use to access the information from various sources. Would you start from primary sources of information, go to the secondary sources of information, and then you go to the preliminary? No. The sequence would be you start with preliminary sources of information, then on the basis of preliminary sources of information, you go to the secondary sources of information, and finally you go to the actual thesis, the dissertation, the research reports, once you find that these articles or these reports or these works are relevant to the study which is being undertaken. So while you abstract the information, it is important that you try to determine the relevance of each work in relation to your study. And you try to see that appropriate methodology, technique of selecting a sample, technique of analysis in relation to the objectives of that study or the hypothesis formulated for the study, and then the context in which the study has been undertaken. These are analyzed in detail to collect relevant information which is worth inclusion in the review of related literature. The researcher also need to determine what information he or she is going to abstract. And maybe as a researcher, you decide that you are going to include the objectives of the study, the methodology which has been followed, the major findings of the study, the conclusions arrived at, and suggestions for further research. So, when you try to abstract information from various studies and various sources of information, each abstract would include information on objectives, on methodology, on the findings, on the conclusions, and finally the suggestions for further research, because it will facilitate the researcher to collate the information at a later point of time. In addition, it is very important that the researcher uses the skills of skimming and scanning and read to study to abstract the information from the various sources of information. For example, when I look at the subject index, I'm using the technique of scanning, and if I'm interested in locating in which part of the book or the journal a word called emotional intelligence appears, this will provide me details about the pages on which emotional intelligence appears in that particular source of information. When I look at the article, I read few lines of each paragraph. I'm trying to skim that information whether it is relevant to my study and should I abstract the information or not. And if I find that the article is relevant, I need to use the skill of read to study so as to comprehend and make a gist of that article. So a researcher has to be very particular when he or she tries to abstract the information from various sources of information. A researcher can also code each abstract which is preparing for the various sources of information and various studies which have been collected. And coding can be done on the basis of the variables. Coding can be done on the basis of the findings of the study. Once the researcher has abstracted the information from the available sources of information, then comes analyzing and organizing and reporting the review of related literature. This is the most crucial step in review of related literature, because if you have collected 100 studies related to your study, now you need to synthesize the whole information, and you can do it by classifying the study on the basis of the variables, that is, studies related to emotional intelligence and job satisfaction. So maybe there are a number of studies which have only dealt with emotional intelligence. There are studies which have been dealt on job satisfaction, and there are studies which have taken both the variables, emotional intelligence and job satisfaction of technical teachers. maybe you can classify the studies on the basis of context, that is, the studies which have been taken in general education, the studies which have been undertaken in the area of technical education. You can classify the studies on the basis of findings, the studies which says there is significant positive correlation between the two, and there are studies which say there is no correlation between the two variables. Or there may be studies which say the relationship exists but it is not significant. So there are different ways of synthesizing the research studies which have been accessed and abstracted by the researcher. And this forms an important part of any research report which is prepared, whether it's a journal article, it also includes a paragraph or two on the previous studies, and a dissertation also includes a full chapter on review of related literature, and the researcher, once has synthesized the research, draws conclusion on the basis of the previous work done. And you also identify the gaps that exist at present in the research which has been done in the area, and that provides justification for your research, and it also helps you on the basis of the conclusion drawn, you can formulate the hypothesis for the present study. So in nutshell, the review of related literature involves identification of the key words, identification of the sources of information, and abstracting the information, and then analyzing, organizing, and synthesizing the result findings of the previous studies, and reporting that synthesis in your journal article or the dissertation which you are preparing.